Robin's worst matchup? Honestly, it might be Zero Suit.
The worst matchup of every character in Smash.
Olimar, explain.
I think this is a fairly common consensus among the wider Robin player base, but I did consult 2 matchup charts for this. The first one was Angels, which has Olimar alongside Aegis,
doesn't even have
Min,
Zero
Pikachu,
Suit there.
Mr. Game & Watch, and Sheik. The second chart was from Morocco Yo.
No Zero Suit? I need to traumatize more people. It's time to go watch Rister Mice and all 85 of his videos on the worst matchups for every single character in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. So I guess we're just gonna go through the top and we're gonna go down.
The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 1, Mario.
Mario is basically anyone with a sword that can like outrange him, right? So like, it used to be Palu. It's probably just Kazuya.
Here we go again. For this series, I will always consult top player matchup charts as my primary source. And
Good.
on Kurama's most recent matchup chart, Sonic is listed at the very bottom.
That's fair.
Right next to Aegis as Mario's worst. Follow and stay tuned.
Those are both reasonable. I'm surprised Kazuya isn't there.
One more part. Donkey Kong
If he's just gonna show the gameplay in the background of everything, then it's gonna kind of spoil it.
chart. And combining it with general opinion, I'm going to say that Donkey Kong's worst matchup is Mr. Game & Watch.
Easy. This video is brought to you by Factor. What is Factor? Factor is a meal delivery service bringing you fresh, never frozen, dietitian approved meals directly to your doorstep. And they have a weekly menu of 35 different meals with over 60 add-ons. They cater to diets like keto, if you're a vegetarian, if you're a vegan. If you're someone like me and you've been eating Factor for like, oh, I don't know, well over a year, I recommend the gourmet meals. Try meals that feature premium ingredients like filet mignon, shrimp, truffle butter. I don't even know what that is, so you know it's fancy. I have Factor almost like every day, like before stream, before I start a long session of gaming. And it's perfect for somebody like me because I want to spend more time gaming and less time worrying about planning meals, cooking meals, or going out and picking them up at like a fast food place, which is always just more expensive. Head to factor75.com, type in code MARS50 for 50% off of your first order and free shipping on your first box. Again, that is factor75.com, or just use the link in the description. Use code MARS50, that's Mars with 2 S's by the way, for 50% off your first order and free shipping on your first box. What are you waiting for? Go order it now.
Link. For this episode, I've consulted the lists of Kyon, the best Link in the world, as well as Flash Blaziken, and I even looked at Zamba's matchup chart, because he used to main Link before picking up Rob, if you weren't aware. And from these sources, I'm gonna go ahead and say that Link's worst matchup is Pyramithra.
I feel like there's no way it's not. Dude, I've literally watched Gluto beat Cosmos with Link. Oh,
Samus and Dark Samus. Finally, an easy episode for once. Samus's worst matchup is certifiably Olimar. One of the primary reasons for this is that Pikmin Toss, which Olimar's neutral centers around, beats out Charge Shot and gets rid of it upon colliding, which just destroys Samus's neutral.
This is factual.
And as Yoshi.
Yoshi can kind of destroy Steve walls, but like they're kind of committal. I'm gonna say Steve.
Yoshi's worst matchup is Samus,
I
who,
could see
funnily
that.
enough, we were just talking about in yesterday's episode. Generally speaking, Yoshi tends to struggle a lot against disjoints and swords. Kirby.
I'm gonna go crazy here, right? I'm gonna say something bizarre. I'm gonna say Belmont.
This one was a little bit harder, but I've decided that Kirby's worst matchup is Sonic. Again though, just like yesterday with Yoshi, Kirby tends to struggle a bit with disjoints and swords.
Everyone
the two
does.
matchup charts I consulted for today's video was J-Jaw's matchup chart, which lists Ike and Shulk alongside Sonic,
Ike?
as well as Galehu's
No, I see
matchup
that.
chart, which has Sonic alongside Ike, Steve, Rob, Samus, and Snake.
Snake? I can see that.
Fox.
Light's gonna kill me if I get this wrong. I'm gonna say Luigi.
Light's matchup chart has Luigi, Mr. Game & Watch, and Pikachu all together in the -2 tier. And while I debated for a while which one to list as Fox's worst, I saw that Light once tweeted out that he lost to Esam, and he called it Fox's worst matchup. Only
What
to
year
then
was that?
fight Meister in loser's bracket, which he called Fox's second worst matchup. I don't know how seriously you guys want to take this tweet, but since I have literally no other sources, it's all I really have to go on. So I'm gonna say that Pikachu is
Wrong.
Fox.
I got the whole character select screen right here, so there's just no way. I gotta get like at least like one of these right. You're right. Game & Watch is right there. Not
Thankfully,
Spargo
we've got
playing
another easy
Game
episode
& Watch.
today. Pikachu's worst matchup is Mr. Game & Watch, bar none. Shiny Mark has actually listed it as Pikachu's only losing matchup. This is mostly
Cap.
because
It's not the
Game &
only
Watch
one.
is
Min Min. Wait, Raw Ruby
Luigi's
owning.
worst matchup is Sephiroth.
No way.
Basically, Luigi struggles a lot with characters that can keep him at bay, like Belmont's whip or Min Min's arms. But Sephiroth's main advantage is that he can edgeguard Luigi really well,
So can
which is one of
Min Min.
Luigi's key Arash's matchup chart, which had Min Min alongside Sephiroth, and lastly, Guy's matchup chart, which had Sephiroth as Luigi's sole.
Yo, there's no way. That's so capped. These guys don't know what they're talking about. Trust me, I know what I'm talking about.
Ness's worst matchup.
Steve.
If I had a nickel for every time I said that a character doesn't like disjoints or swords, but also just loses to Sonic or Game & Watch, I'm about to have a lot of nickels by the end of this series. Mr. Game & Watch just puts Ness in disadvantage and never lets up. Ness doesn't have a strong disjoint to challenge Mr. Game & Watch's
He
air.
does. He can trade
also
with
gets
whatever.
juggled.
Whatever. It's like actually Falcons is probably like Pikachu. This is I'm gonna be wrong. It's Pikachu for
Not
Falcon.
to mention the worst matchup of every character
Oh
in
yeah,
Smash.
I forgot. It's Game & Watch. How do I keep forgetting about Game & Watch, guys? God damn it. All right, Jigglypuff's worst matchup. I'm gonna guess it's like Ice Climbers or something.
The worst matchup of every
Sonic.
character in Smash, Part 12.
It's always top tiers,
Jigglypuff.
man.
Guys, it's not Game & Watch this time. Instead, Jigglypuff's worst matchup is Sonic.
All right, Peach and Daisy, it's Game & Watch. Give me $1 million.
The worst matchup of every character in Smash.
Why is it not
Part
showing Game & Watch
13
gameplay?
Is actually between either Mr. Game & Watch or Sonic. Why do I even try? One of which being
Take a
Mutace's,
shot every time
which
Mr.
has
Mice says
Mr.
Game & Watch.
and
I'll
Sonic
explode.
As the Mutace has a better record against the top Game & Watches compared to the top Sonics. I'm just gonna go ahead and say that Peach's worst matchup.
No, dude. No, dude. No, it's just wrong. It's Game & Watch. Bowser's worst matchup. Game & Watch.
The worst matchup of every character.
It's
in Smash, Part
Kazuya. Oh,
14.
because it's they're especially free
Bowser.
combo
So 15.
Ice Climbers. All right, I'm gonna not say Game & Watch this time, and I'm gonna say it's Aegis.
The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 15, Ice Climber. So here's a weird episode. Ice Climber's worst matchup is Simon and Richter Belmont.
Not my ICs.
Yeah, I know,
Nope,
too.
I win
But
those.
basically, Ice Climbers loses to disjoints and swords harder than maybe any other character. And because of things like Cross and Axe, Belmont can actually zone out Ices better than some other characters like
Sheik's
Cloud,
worst
Sephiroth,
matchup
or Min Min.
is Snake.
So get this. For the first time, I was actually able to ask a top player what their worst matchup is. WebJP released this matchup chart as a part of their campaign for Watch the Throne, which had Steve, Pac-Man, and Olimar in the
Forgot about
-2
Pac-Man.
tier. I actually asked WebJP which of these matchups they considered to be Sheik's worst. And I was told that Web goes between either Steve or Pac-Man for being Sheik's worst. It just depends on the day. And here's where Void's matchup chart comes in. As Void
is hella retired. We're taking this seriously. Zelda's the next character to Min Min.
the worst matchup of every
Oh,
character
this makes
in
actually
Smash.
a lot of sense. I was gonna say Zero Suit, but she sucks ass, and she's no one's worst matchup.
This one is also gonna be a weird episode. Zelda's worst matchup is Zero Suit Samus. For this episode, I consulted 3 different matchup charts. The first was Ven's, which has ZSS in the -2 tier alongside Joker, Peach, and Daisy. I also consulted Alo's matchup chart, which had ZSS at the very bottom of the -2 tier alongside Sonic, Aegis, Fox, Steve, and Greninja.
These low
And
tiers,
lastly,
man.
I consulted Zefty's matchup chart, which had ZSS alongside Fox, Wolf, Cloud,
Not
and
me
Joker.
teabagging,
In these
dude.
matchup charts, the most recurring characters were ZSS, Joker, and Fox. And of the 3 charts that I consulted, Zero Suit Samus is the only character that showed up in the -2 tier.
Dr. Mario. Dude, every character destroys that character. What the heck?
I'll say Lucina. Why not?
All 3 of them. The worst matchup of every character in
Shulk.
Smash.
The
Part
other
18,
character with a big ass
Dr. Mario.
sword.
Dr. Mario's worst matchup is Shulk. This episode is a little bit difficult, not only because there's not a lot of top doc mains, but because even among that limited number, not a lot of them have published matchup charts.
All
Mario
right,
suffers
Pichu's hardest matchup. Steve, Game & Watch. I think it's just Game & Watch, right?
the worst matchup of every character in
Samus.
Smash.
Okay,
Part
let me get this straight. Pikachu's worst matchup is Game & Watch, but Pichu's worst matchup is Samus.
This episode is another peculiar one.
Explain.
Pichu's worst matchup is Samus, and technically Dark Samus as well. It seems that a lot of people think that Mr. Game & Watch should be Pichu's worst matchup, basically for the same reasons that Mr. Game & Watch beats Pikachu. But when I consulted Natoru's matchup chart, it actually had Samus and Dark Samus as Pichu's worst.
EU bias. Falco's definitely Game & Watch.
Matchup character in
Yep,
Smash,
I see
Part
Game & Watch.
20,
Yep,
Falco.
Yep. Marth and Lucina probably get
matchup check by the same right? I feel like they probably get destroyed by Joker.
The worst matchup of every character in Smash Part
Greninja.
21, Marth. This is probably the most difficult episode of this series so far. The only two high-level matchup charts for Marth that exist are Rizeyasu's and Krieg's. However, Rizeyasu's matchup chart stated that Marth doesn't lose any
He's
matchups.
trolling.
Another case of Japan's matchup charts being unique. Krieg's matchup chart has Bowser and Greninja as the only -1, yes, -1, matchups. And when asked by a reply which one was harder, Krieg responded that it was Greninja. That choice seems to be a fairly acceptable consensus, so I'm just gonna go ahead and say that Marth's worst matchup is Greninja.
This is so troll, dude. I'm getting trolled by top players, not even doing the video, man. Young Link? Probably Zero Suit, honestly. Young Link, kind of. But no one's going to say that. No one's going to say Young Link's worst matchup is Zero Suit because nobody plays against any good Zero Suits. Shulk?
Young Link.
Kind of makes sense.
Young Link is not particularly fond of disjoints or swords.
Young Link doesn't give a shit about disjoints or swords. Hello, you're wrong. Ganondorf? Dude, you got your pick of the litter for Ganondorf. I'm going to say Game & Watch.
The worst matchup of every
Min-Min?
character in
Yeah,
Smash
I mean,
Part 24,
sorry, dude.
Ganondorf. Ganondorf's worst matchup is Min-Min. As the worst character in the game, Ganondorf's worst matchup could theoretically be a lot of characters. At the very least, most of the game's...
He loses to like half the cast is his worst matchup, let's be honest here. Mewtwo's worst matchup? I'll say Olimar, why not?
The worst matchup of every character in
Fox?
Smash
You
Part
can edgeguard him.
25, Mewtwo. Mewtwo's worst matchup
It's
is
pretty bad,
Fox.
though. I'll give it up.
It's a little bit odd. I wasn't expecting it to be Fox. But for this episode, I consulted the matchup charts of both Anvil and Remrin, two of the best Mewtwo's in the world.
Roy's worst matchup, we'll say, is Kazuya.
The worst matchup of every character in
Pikachu?
Smash Part 26,
How many random Kazuyas have beaten Cola, dude? Oh my.
Roy. Roy's worst matchup is Pikachu. Basically, Roy is infamous for losing to 3 characters: Kazuya, Pichu, and Pikachu. For me, it was really just a question of which one do I pick. And once again, it came down to matchup charts having certain characters
Boo.
in
Cola
common.
just sucks.
Cola
No, the hell
has
he
both
doesn't.
Pichu
Show some respect.
and Pikachu as Roy's worst matchup.
Alright, so I
sharing
guess
the
Chrom
tier
is also
together.
losing to Pikachu,
Flow,
right?
The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 27, Chrom. So in all honesty, just like Marth and Lucina, Chrom and Roy are pretty similar in which matchups they lose. I could have just lumped the two of them together and no one would have batted an eye. But also, weirdly enough, just like my Marth and Lucina videos, Chrom and Roy
just
don't
no way,
actually have
dude.
the same worst matchup. That's because Chrom's worst matchup is Joker.
Nope.
For this,
Game & Watch's worst matchup. I guess we're gonna say Zero Suit, right?
the worst matchup of every
Or-
character
oh,
in
I
Smash,
forgot.
Part 28.
There's a
Mr.
character way
Game
better
&
than Zero
Watch.
Suit.
I literally played Roblox with Meister on stream a few days ago and forgot to ask what Game & Watch's worst matchup
This
is.
dude was having too much fun playing Roblox. What the heck?
Game & Watch's worst matchup as either Diddy Kong, Shulk, or Ike. Meister has it as either ZSS, Sonic, Rosalina, or Shulk. And Mia's matchup chart has either ZSS,
Of course.
Diddy Kong, Sonic, Wolf, Rosalina, Hero, or Aegis as Game & Watch's worst matchup. Which means that for perhaps the first time, there is not a single character in common between all 3 charts, right? Well, no, because Monty's matchup chart is severely outdated. I know this because I DM'd Monty to ask about it, and I was told that
See, I couldn't get that out of me.
these days, Monty thinks
This
that
dude loves
Mr. Game &
Roblox.
Watch's worst matchup is Sonic. This means that we have a common consensus between all 3 matchup charts. And as such, I'm gonna go ahead and say that Mr. Game & Watch's worst matchup is Sonic.
Hey, I'll take it. That means Zero Suit is even worse than we thought. Next one is Meta Knight. I feel like it's probably just Steve. I don't know shit about Meta Knight.
Meta Knight's worst matchup is Zero Suit Samus.
Okay, I knew it was bad, but your worst?
The first was Bonks, which has ZSS in her own tier as far and away Meta Knight's worst matchup. The other is Shows, which has the -1s and the...
What Zero Suits are they getting waxed by? Holy. Alright, so Pit and Dark Pit are next. I'm gonna say Steve.
Part 30,
It's not Zero
Pit
Suit.
and Dark Pit. This episode's a tad complicated. There are only 3 matchup charts I could find that I'd consider to be relatively high level. And one of them is from Shiny Mark, who doesn't main Pit. That chart has Sheik and ZSS in the -1 tier.
Why are we thinking Zero Suit's good?
Another matchup chart is from Pit and Wii Fit co-main Silver, which has ZSS alongside Greninja. But there's also Tet, a high-level Japanese Pit main, who doesn't have ZSS in contention for Pit's worst, and
Good.
instead has a ton of characters that notably includes Greninja, meaning that I'm stuck either having to pick Greninja or ZSS as Pit's worst. That being said, it seems as though ZSS is the more common consensus among NA.
Let me, as the best Zero Suit Samus player, tell you that that matchup is not that bad, and you should watch my pit versus literally, and I mean literally, any Zero Suit Samus player in the world. Anyway, Zero Suit Samus is next, which means that if I get this wrong, I jump off the balcony, right? I think Zero Suit's worst matchup is Aegis right now.
The worst matchup of every
Hey, I'm
character
right.
in Smash, Part 31, Zero Suit Samus. We've
like I
been
know
talking
something.
about ZSS for 2 episodes straight now. 3 if you include the Game & Watch episode. But who is ZSS's worst matchup? Well, that honor is going to go to Pyramithra. For this episode, I consulted Mars's matchup chart, which has
Wait, what did I put? Okay, hold on. Before I even look at that matchup chart, all right, what would be my -2s, my awfuls? Aegis, Pikachu, Diddy Kong, Greninja, Joker, Loki, Inkling, but no one would talk about it, Roy, Chrom. Den's character is all right, what did I put? Oh, Olimar. I forgot about Olimar and PT. Those are the only ones I forgot about, but I've added more since then. Holy.
I also consulted the charts of 3 other top ZSS reps, including Doorstop, Naito Sharp, and Shu. And among these charts, it's worth noting that Fox, Wolf, Diddy, Cloud, and Shulk are all considered to be pretty bad. But Aegis was the most common choice to have as the worst or near
You did
worst
good,
matchup.
Mr. Mice.
As for
You
why,
figured it out.
from
Wario,
our hearts,
Luigi,
the
or
worst
Game & Watch.
Smash
Olimar.
Part 32, Wario. Apparently, Wario's worst matchup is Olimar. So I know what you're thinking. And let me be clear, when I started making this episode, I thought it was going to be Sonic 2, but the numbers just don't add up. I had to consult 6 different matchup charts for today's video.
I don't even give a about all that. Snake's worst matchup, which is the next one, is Game & Watch. It's not Mega Man.
33,
Mega Man's very
Snake.
hard.
Snake's
but-
worst matchup is Mega Man. Apollo Kage thinks that Snake's worst matchup is Min Min, but it seems as though AK is alone in this line of thinking. And Inkling, again, I'm gonna go with the most common denominator and say that Snake's worst matchup.
It's pretty safe, but I think that it's definitely Game & Watch, and Snake players are just two Stockholms from outplaying Nesses and Game & Watches. And we got Ike. Oh god, it's probably Aegis low-key.
The worst matchup of every character in
Roy?
Smash Part
That's
34,
Cap?
Ike. Ike's worst matchup is Roy. Basically, the debate for being Ike's worst matchup is mostly between Joker or Roy. The main supporter of the Joker argument is Raven King, who has Joker as Ike's sole -2 matchup. The main supporter of the Roy argument is Psychod, who has Roy as Ike's sole -3 matchup. It's also worth
Super
noting
Cap.
that I consulted the matchup charts of both Mega as well as Johnny, but both of them listed both Roy and Joker among Ike's worst. So here's what I'll do. It seems as though Roy is the more common consensus more recently. And so I'm gonna say that Ike's worst matchup
because they have bad
Roy.
ground games.
As far as I understand, the
Trash Ike
reasoning
players.
behind it.
What would PT's worst matchup be? This is a real head scratcher because we got 3 little bastards to think about. I'm gonna say Joker.
Pokemon
Samus?
Trainer's worst matchup is Samus. Yeah, so I think a lot of people might disagree with me on this one. And they're gonna say that it should be Young Link. And for what it's worth, Young
Those people, what the hell? I don't know any of these people.
Link, but it appears that, over time, more and more top PT mains are gravitating towards Samus rather than Yink being the worst.
I guess so, man. All right, Diddy Kong's worst matchup is Pac-Man, Isabelle, and Villager. But I'm gonna say for this video, Steve.
The worst matchup of every character in
course
Smash
they're gonna
Part
say Duck
36, Diddy Kong. Diddy Kong's worst matchup is Duck Hunt. Bet you didn't think Duck Hunt would win one of these episodes, did ya? I know what people are already thinking, and yes, Pac-Man is also extremely hard. Just like yesterday's episode where I said Young Link was the runner-up for PT's worst, Pac-Man is definitely the runner-up for Diddy's worst. For this episode, I consulted Tweak's chart, which has Fox, Pac-Man, and Duck Hunt in the -2 tier, as well as Ryuo's, which has Pac-Man and Duck Hunt alongside Young Link in the -2 tier. However, the real difference maker here was Zenodo, who has Pac-Man in even, and instead has Duck Hunt, Villager, Isabelle, and
So it's either Pac-Man. I've never seen a Diddy Kong player beat a Steve. That's all I'm saying. Lucas's worst matchup, Min Min.
Smash
Zero
Part
Suit.
37.
Is this real?
Lucas's worst matchup is Zero Suit Samus. So this episode is a treat, because this is one of the few episodes where I was actually able to talk to a top rep.
Not a top rep of Zero Suit.
That top rep was Regalo,
Who the fuck is he playing?
who had Zero Suit Samus in the Don't Bother tier of their matchup chart alongside Min Min, Olimar, and Young Link. This opinion is supported by Nightox, who has ZSS in the -2 tier alongside a bunch of other characters, as well as Japanese Lucas main Rinkaruru. Regalo's chart was recent, so I was able to reply and ask specifically which one was Lucas's worst and, more importantly, why. I was told that ZSS was far and away Lucas's worst. ZSS can outzone Lucas with Nair and Zair, is good at staying above Lucas where he can't effectively challenge her, and Lucas's combos are inconsistent against her.
I'll take their word for it, bro. I don't play any Lucas's. Sonic's worst matchup? I'm about to say he's gonna say Corrin for the clickbait watch. Never
The
played
worst
Bubs,
matchup of every character in Smash,
Oh,
part
Fox?
38,
Wait, true.
Sonic. Follow and stay tuned for more parts. Okay, I'm just kidding. Sonic's worst matchup is Fox. I actually consulted 2 of Sonic's matchup charts. Both the normal one,
Sonic's put Zero Suit even. All right, I'm moving on. King Dede's worst matchup.
and
Zero
the
Suit.
the worst matchup of
Sora?
every character in
I have
Smash,
no
part
idea. Olimar's worst matchup. Link.
The worst matchup?
It's Cloud. Wait, that's been that way since Smash 4. I'm kind of trolling right now. I'm not gonna lie. Lucario's worst matchup. Kazuya.
The worst matchup of every character in Smash, part 41.
bro. Rob's worst matchup is Game & Watch.
The worst matchup
Yes!
of every character in
Yes!
Smash, part
All right, the next one is Toon Link. I have literally no idea what Toon Link struggles against. He's super floaty. So I'm gonna say he loses to Fox.
Toon Link's worst matchup is Pyramithra, aka AJ.
Sure,
part
man, that checks out.
43.
All right, Wolf's worst matchup. Gotta be a heavyweight, right? Or some DLC bullshit. I'm gonna say Terry.
The worst matchup of every
Sonic.
character in Smash,
It's
part
not
44.
Sonic, you have Blaster. Villager, if I learned anything from Smash 4, it's Cloud.
So with
Who is
about
that?
83
Hero.
characters
Oh,
and
bounce.
1 or 2 bonus episodes, I'm just gonna go ahead and consider this to be the halfway point of this series. With that said, Villager's worst matchup is Hero. Panda Bear has Hero at the very bottom of their matchup chart. And the same goes for Bobby Wasabi, who has Hero alongside Me Sword Fighter and Min Min as Villager's worst. And lastly, Javi on Earth, while notably thinking that Aegis is worse, still has Hero as a bottom 3 matchup.
Sheesh. Next is Mega Man. Oh, he loses to Wolf super f***ing hard.
During
Pika?
Smash Part 46,
I used to counterpick Mega Man for Pikachu. What the heck? What was I cooking?
none of the reps agree. Peebnut thinks that Mega Man's only losing matchup is Palutena. And MPG's most recent matchup chart has Mr. Game & Watch, Fox, and Pikachu as Mega Man's worst matchups. Out of these specific opinions, I'm gonna go with Pikachu, as it seems to be the most commonly accepted of these choices within the wider community.
All right, next one is Wii Fit. Steve?
The worst matchup of every character
Game
in
and
Smash,
Watch. Of
Part
course,
46.
of course. If it's not Steve, it's Game & Watch. Rosalina Luma. Big ass disjoints. Kill Luma immediately. Sounds like Min Min to me, dude.
The worst matchup of every
Or
character
that
in
one.
Smash, Part 48. Played
Little Mac's worst matchup. Sheik. Except
Little
my
Mac's
Little Mac wins
worst
these.
matchup is Pac-Man. My 3 main sources for this episode are Peanut, Quaz, and Tarakatori. Peanut's matchup chart isn't available anymore, but it had Pac-Man as Little Mac's sole -3 matchup.
Crazy that Game & Watch is the worst matchup for like half the cast. It's so irrelevant for them that Game & Watch isn't even top 10. Well, hold on. Let's stop coping here real quick. Game & Watch is OP. Greninja's worst matchup? Fox. Even though low-key it's supposed to be Steve.
The worst matchup of every character in
Sonic?
Smash?
Bro, it's not Sonic. Why does everyone think that's Sonic?
No one can agree. Tarek has Mega Man and Wario as Greninja's worst, and once told me that it was Wario, bar none. But every other Greninja has told me that Tarek is wrong and is just scarred by gluttony. Ice Knight far and away.
That makes sense,
but
actually.
Ice
Snake
Knight
is definitely
the
a hard one.
only Greninja to have Snake in contention for Greninja's worst. Rarcure's chart has Sonic and Pichu out of nowhere, and Anarch.
Alright, Greninja mains are unintelligent. Palu, which is
There isn't a
Sonic's worst
tier
matchup.
named
Oh, I
Diddy
forgot the
Kong or
rats
Pikachu.
destroy this
On
dude.
Team Diddy Kong, we have Jagaimo, who has Diddy at the very bottom of their matchup.
Pac-Man's worst matchup? Fox.
During
Wolf?
Smash,
That
part
makes sense.
55.
Robin's worst matchup? Honestly, it might be Zero Suit.
The worst matchup of every character in Smash. Part
Olimar.
50
Explain.
matchup. I think this is a fairly common consensus among the wider Robin player base, but I did consult 2 matchup charts for this. The first one was Angels, which has Olimar alongside Aegis,
Doesn't even have
Min,
Zero Suit
Pikachu,
there.
Mr. Game & Watch, and Sheik. The second chart was from Morocco Yo.
No Zero Suit? I need to traumatize more people. Shulk's worst matchup is Snake.
Sorry about this, Ramses, but Shulk's worst matchup is
Don't
Snake.
ask why I know.
For all
Bowser
that stems
Jr.?
around
I'm gonna
Grenade,
say
and how useful it is as a
it's either Game & Watch or Sonic.
The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 58.
Oh, true!
Bowser Jr. Bowser Jr.'s worst matchup is Zero Suit Samus.
Who's the Zero
This
Suit?
comes directly from Yoda Cage, who has ZSS in her own tier of difficulty. But Ketchup thinks that ZSS is only a -1.
Duck Hunt just loses to everything, bro. What would Duck Hunt lose? Like, he would lose to, like, what, Rosa and, like, Villager? I'm gonna say Rosa.
59.
The hot dog?
Duck
What?
Hunt. Duck Hunt's worst matchup is Mega Man. This comes directly from MboZ and Sekai Doggo, who both had Mega Man in the -2.
I'm gonna visualize this matchup.
Real quick, because there's no way, right?
I can see it. Let
tier
me
of
see
their
what he
matchup
says.
charts. MboZ had Mega Man alongside Joker as Duck Hunt's worst, and Sekai Doggo had Cloud alongside Mega Man in their chart. Also, big Duck Hunt fan 7000 once told me that Steve was Duck Hunt's worst matchup, but as far as I can tell, that seems to be an outlier, so I'm gonna go with Mega Man.
Like, why does everyone think they do good against Steve? Like, there's no way Steve isn't more common for... Like, he's the best character in the game, and you're telling me that's not your worst matchup? Whatever. Ryu's worst matchup? Apparently it's Kirby, man.
The worst matchup of every character in Smash,
Oh,
part
Steve?
60, Ryu. So this episode is really weird. Let me start by saying that I'm going with Steve being Ryu's worst matchup. My main source on this is Vendetta, who has Steve in his own tier of difficulty on their matchup chart. And interestingly enough, also has Ice Climbers in their own tier
I
of
could see that,
difficulty
Ice
right
Climbers.
under Steve. But Ashimo also has a matchup chart, one that was made a week ago, which has Greninja and Ridley as Ryu's worst matchup.
The Ridley just it has to be troll, bro.
Yeah, and if you think that's peculiar, Ashimo's last matchup chart had King DDD as Ryu's second worst matchup.
Alright, no, Asimo is actually just trolling. Ken is probably the same thing, right?
Character
Of
in
course,
Smash,
it's Game &
part
Watch. Yeah,
6.
of course. I mean, why wouldn't it be Game & Watch? Alright, Cloud's worst matchup is Aegis.
The worst matchup of every
I
character in
knew
Smash,
the
part
answer.
60.
Corrin's worst matchup, Corrin's worst matchup, Corrin's worst matchup, Corrin's worst matchup, Corrin's worst matchup. Fox.
Correct
Cheek!
character in Smash, part 63, Corrin. This episode is hard because obviously my two sources are Neo and Shattuck, but they don't actually agree on what Corrin's worst matchup is. Neo's matchup chart says that Corrin's worst matchup is Sheik, while Shattuck's matchup chart says that Corrin's worst matchup is either Fox or Snake. And then Neo and Shattuck collaborated together to make another matchup chart, which has Sheik and Snake as Corrin's worst, which again ties Snake and Sheik up at 2-2. So I had no choice but to consult a third opinion.
Look at the
Lai,
bracket.
the Corrin who beat Spargo at SmashCon, has Corrin's worst matchups as Sheik and Sephiroth. And with that tiebreaker, I'm gonna go ahead and say that Corrin's worst matchup is Sheik.
I actually wouldn't have guessed that. I would assume that Sheik just runs into all your Bayonetta's worst matchup is probably Game & Watch.
Matchup
Oh,
of
it's
every
Sonic,
character
yeah.
in Smash, part
I forgot
64.
about that one.
Worst.
There's just too many characters. Inkling's worst matchup is Game & Watch.
The worst matchup of every character in Smash,
It's-
part
does that say
65.
Shulk?
Inkling. Inkling's worst.
I'm done, bro. I'm done. Ridley's worst matchup is Shulk.
The worst
I'm
matchup of every
crashing out.
character in
Oh,
Smash,
great,
part
Rob. A real answer. Awesome. Simon Belmont loses to Sheik.
The worst matchup of every character in Smash, part 67, Simon and Rick. And Zero Suit Samus is listed at the very bottom, with common
I
other
mean, it's
choices in
fair.
the minus.
K. Rool's worst matchup is Kazuya.
The worst matchup of character
Awesome,
in Smash,
dude. Yeah, it's some other dumbass that doesn't make any sense. Isabel. Sonic.
character in
God
Smash, part
damn it.
69, Isabel. Isabel's worst matchup is Pikachu. This comes directly from Mr. Zircon.
Disagree.
who has
Incineroar's worst matchup, Greninja.
The worst matchup of every character in Smash,
What is
part
that?
70,
Who character?
Incineroar. Incineroar's worst
Oh,
matchup is
dude, I knew this one. Oh my god, I know that one. Oh my god. Dude, they're gonna make Zerasu look like a good character. This chart sucks. Piranha Plant's worst matchup is Cloud.
This episode will 100% take the award for the weirdest answer in the entire series. Because Piranha Plant's worst matchup is Isabel. Yeah, I'm not kidding. I averaged the charts of several Piranha Plants, namely Gruward, Brood, Amasara, and Diz. I would show you the -2 sections of these charts, but they wouldn't fit onto the screen. The averaged results show that the 3 worst matchups for
I guess because he doesn't have an option to deal with down B. I don't know, man. Yeah, Rister Mice. I'm sure Isabel is harder for Steve than Steve for Plant. Yeah, for sure, dude. Alright, Joker's worst matchup is Sonic.
Plant are the worst matchup of every character in Smash.
I figured
part
it out.
72,
I'm a genius.
Joker.
I'm a
Joker's
genius.
worst matchup is Sonic. This comes directly from MK Leo, who has Sonic all by himself at the very bottom of
I'm
their
a genius.
matchup chart.
Hero's worst matchup is Rob.
The worst matchup of every character in Smash, part
We've done
73, Hero. We've finally arrived at the episode that I've been looking forward to the least. But I'm gonna say that Hero's worst
Isn't
matchup
he a hero
is
player?
Rob. This is coming from only the best hero main, Spice, who has Rob all by himself in the -2 tier. Oh, and also this
Who's a
other
Min-Min
hero
player.
main named Beast Mode Paul, I think, who has Rob alongside Zero Suit Samus, but mostly from Spice. Okay, haha, very funny, Rister.
All right, what's Banjo's worst matchup? Game & Watch.
The worst matchup of every character
Yeah,
in
it's a little
Smash
more.
Part
Yeah,
74.
yeah.
Banjo
Anyway,
and
Terry's worst matchup is Sonic.
the worst matchup of every
Of
character
course,
in
it's Aegis
Smash
and not
Part
Sonic.
7.
It's one of those fast assholes that just out hitbox you no matter what you try to do. Violet's worst matchup is Joker.
The worst matchup of every
Sonic,
character
of course,
in Smash
the other
Part
fast who
6.
just whatever.
Violet.
Min Min's worst
If you
matchup
didn't
is
know any better, you may
Sheik.
assume. Okay, fine, I concede. Min Min's worst matchup is Sheik.
Well, I
Part
did it.
77.
I was right.
Min Min.
All right, guys, big news. Steve is next. Are the Steve players trash and they put Zero Suit, or are they putting the real answer, Cloud? What do you guys think? Hold through monitor if it's Zero Suit.
The worst matchup of every character
Sonic!
in Smash Part 78. Steve. So a lot like the Me Brawler episode, the Steve community really helped me out on this one. Rockman gathered around 20 Steve mains, including Akola, Onin, DD, Syrup, Sor, Susu, and many more. And with their help,
That's weird how no other character has so many reps. That's really, I wonder what that's about. I don't know why it would be like that.
made 2 Steve matchup charts.
Sonic
One
is,
chart was
I
based
guess,
off
real.
a popular vote between all of them.
But I did just watch what Carmelo did to Sonic's, and I don't know.
The other chart that they made was a mathematical average of all their separate charts mixed together. This chart was fully ordered and had Cloud and Sonic next to each other, with Cloud at minus 0.525 and Sonic at minus 0.65. And since Sonic is the lowest one on this chart and is the only
All
character
right, Sephiroth's worst matchup is about to be like... Definitely Ganon. Yeah, for sure, man. All right, let's do Diddy Kong.
the worst matchup of every
Hey,
character
whoever's
in
a Diddy
Smash
Kong,
Part
pat yourself on the back.
79,
You're a genius.
Sephiroth.
Aegis's worst matchup, Diddy Kong. Oh wait, yeah, maybe Diddy Kong.
The worst matchup of every character
Yeah,
in
Diddy Kong
Smash
again.
Part 80, Pyramithra, aka
The anti-DLC
Aegis.
Pack
If you
2
were
character.
to ask the Aegis player base, a lot of them will likely tell you that Min Min is Aegis's worst matchup. But I'm here to argue that Aegis's worst matchup is not Min Min, but is instead Diddy Kong.
Kazuya's worst matchup is Sonic.
But every
Yahoo!
character in
All the
Smash
fighting game
Part
characters,
81,
yahoo!
Kazuya.
Except for Ryu, apparently, who loses the hardest to Isabel and King Dedede. F you, Asimo. All right, and the last character is Sora, who probably loses the hardest to like, is it like Min Min or something?
The worst matchup of every character
Oh,
in
it's
Smash
Fox
Part
or
82.
whatever, man.
Sora. Sora's worst matchup is Fox. This is courtesy of Kameme, who has Diddy Kong and Fox in the minus
I mean, that's
2
fair. I watched Kameme get absolutely waxed by Light.
The worst matchup of every character in Smash, Part 84.
It is
Random.
Game & Watch.
Okay, Rister, what is this? Basically, this episode is an excuse for me to tally up the results from this series and tell you who won the most episodes. The reasoning being that if you went random, this character is most likely to be your worst matchup, and therefore is random's worst matchup. Just to note, this is taking yesterday's corrections into account. The top 4 of this series is Sonic in first place with 11 characters,
Sonic.
the only one to reach double digits. Mr. Game & Watch in second place with 9 characters.
Would you guys look at that?
Zero Suit's a top 4 character because she's 5 characters worst matchups. Woo!